warm welcome to my panelists, and I do not doubt that you probably have some reactions to some of what you've heard from Dr. Tade already. And so maybe let me start off with Dr. Kole. Let me start with you right at the end. A reaction to, thank you very much, and we're going to use the microphones on your block there, thank you very much. A reaction to what you've heard. I see you've brought your notes, so I know you've probably been taking some of your notes. What's challenged you the most in terms of what you've heard from Dr. Tade? But also your own contribution as to what do you think are the most significant shifts that are really pushing African philanthropy to this, the frontier, and also almost to this confrontation of what the next frontier needs to be. What are the major shifts that you are seeing?
Thank you very much, and I appreciate this opportunity. Thank Tade for this wonderful presentation. Thank to the organizers for inviting us, and also apologies for number of people who have, I think, asked for meetings, and I've not really figured out the technology on how do I make those meetings. So sorry about that one as well. I think Tade raised a very important issue, and that has to do with the values. Because at the end of the day, this work is about values. What do we really believe in? What do we really think we should be doing? What do we do as human beings? What keeps us awake in this continent? So for me, the question of values is the most critical point that he has made. That this work that we are doing it because we believe that we are contributing to improving the quality of lives of ordinary human beings. If we get that right, as Sadia has suggested, then I think we are on the path of making the kind of change that we need to make in the continent. This is not about 5 to 9 job. This is not about being a career director. This is not about an NGO person. This is not about JFK Airport, but this is about human beings. And how do we ensure that whatever we do, we focus on the human beings? Quickly on the question that you asked me about what I see the shift. So one of the things that I really been impressed with the shift is part of the community of people who are even here. The fact that people have left their own small organizations, but have come together to organize on a Pan-African level and to see that all of us have a stake on something bigger than our own individual organizations. That all of us, when we bring our collective energy, our collective resources and networks, we can actually do something bigger than ourselves. Thank you very much.
Dr. Kole, thank you very much. I'm going to stay with you a little bit because I think you've brought to the surface something very important. Dr. Tade says to us, let's go back to the basics. Let's go back to the values. Let's go back to the why are we doing this. You've raised the same point again. He said this is not about building an industry. It's about doing good. My follow-up question to you is, what is standing in the way of us going back to basics and aligning on those values? Why do you think we're stuck in this moment building industries and careers instead of focusing on the work of just doing good?
I'm not sure that I can answer that question, but let me say that I think that so people like Mama Gracia Marshall and others, and a number of the people here, are people who come from a different background from probably some of the other people who have joined this industry. So the values that they stood up for, known for, worked for, probably are not the same values that is driving many of us in this place. And because we have a different sense, idea of what we should be, who we should be, I think that is where the stumbling block is. How do we get those values right and make it that our mission in life is improving the quality of lives of ordinary people? Thank you.
Dr. Kole, thank you very much. I move on to yourself, Dr. Dulani, because I'm going to make my way down the row, if you will. When you engage with the question of the next frontier, what is the opportunity you're hearing in that question? What does it mean to move to the next frontier? And what, in your view, might be different in terms of how philanthropy is practiced, how philanthropy is lived, how philanthropy is experienced? What's the difference between the frontier we're at now and the next frontier?
Thank you. And again, thank you for the keynote speaker and also the speakers that spoke earlier this morning. It's quite clear that the African philanthropy has done quite a lot over the years, but also listening to the speakers, there have been a lot of changes, and we are seeing those changes and living through them as we speak. Issues to do with climate change, technology, among others that have been highlighted by the various speakers. As much as I think there's a lot that's been achieved already, the new changes require and call upon us, I think, to be adaptive. So the future or this new frontier has to be adaptive, has to respond to these emerging issues. And I think quite a number, as I said, have already been well articulated. But I would like to zero in on two specific areas. Climate change. The organization that I work for, Afrobarometer, we've been asking about climate change. And I remember when we started to ask about this topic, we were kind of hesitant. We felt that maybe African citizens won't even know what climate change is. But we've been really quite, pleasantly surprised that there's quite a lot of knowledge about climate change, and that the overall impact of climate change on our people is one that is negative. About 7 in 10 of our citizens in the countries that we do our surveys tell us that climate change has made their lives worse. There's increased flooding. My own country of Malawi, we kind of going through these cycles. 1 year we have droughts, the next year we have excessive flooding. And this calls, I think, for the new frontier, the new African philanthropy, to look at emerging issues like climate change and address, I think, this particular issue. Technological advancements that, again, our keynote speaker and others have highlighted earlier this morning. I think, again, an area that calls for challenge. And I think it speaks, I think, to a topic that, again, is close to my heart in terms of data-driven approaches to philanthropy. And I think that's an area that I think we need to address. I think there was a time when most of the people who deal with data would look at African countries and just look at the gaps to say data not available, data not available. I think Africa, is fair to say, now has become a beehive of data gathering. Gone are those days when there was no data on Africa, and I think it behooves all of us working in this area to make sure that we tap in, I think, to this data that is available, especially data that speaks, I think, to the views of ordinary citizens, so that we can make sure that the interventions that we make, the areas, the issues that we support are also in line with what the citizens of this continent are prioritizing.
Dr. Dulani, I think that's such an excellent point, and I just want to double tap on it. If indeed we are able to leverage the capacity to collect data, to store data, to analyze data, what could that mean for African philanthropic organizations that are looking to make systemic change? What can they do with this superpower that would catapult them to the next frontier?
I think for a long time we've actually let, I think, other people to come and give us resources to collect the kind of data, but usually it's the data that they need rather than what we ourselves as Africans need. And that's where the African philanthropy, I think, can contribute quite a great deal. It's not an area that has seen quite a lot of resources going into research, and it's understandable. There are quite a lot of pressing needs. But it's an area, I think, that we need to make sure we direct resources into the arena of research, so that the research and the results that come out are defined by ourselves as Africans and is speaking to the needs that our Africans also prioritize.
What I'm hearing is the ability to own our own data gives us the ability to tell our own story. But I want to maybe jump to Halima and Dierdre. I'm skipping you because I'm intentionally wanting to come to the lens of the global north towards the end of this first round of conversations. But I want to jump to you, Halima, because I somewhat sense that you might have a reaction to what Dr. Dulani has noted at the beginning of his response, which is African philanthropists need to adapt and respond to changing trends. And the reason why I'm bringing that to you is that Dr. Tade was saying to us that giving is in our DNA. It's who we are. So I'm a little bit lost and hoping you can give me a little bit of clarification. Which comes first? Is it our responsibility to adapt or respond? Or should African philanthropists be thinking about setting the agenda for what philanthropy needs to look like in Africa? How do you react to that statement, that we adapt and respond?
Thank you, Nozipho. It's hard to do this and look at you at the same time. So a couple of things. One is, which philanthropy are we talking about? You know, I think we use African philanthropy as a default when often we mean institutionalized philanthropy. And we've talked about our everyday giving, which is also philanthropy. And when we're asking these questions, let's be clear who we're asking it of. Yes, we are. Philanthropy has been existing on our continent for generations. It is growing. Tade has said there's no doubt now about our narratives of African philanthropy being out there. There's no question around those. Are we asking those to adapt and change? Or are we asking who majority of the people in the room are, who are part of an institutionalized philanthropy space, to rethink and reimagine what is the role of philanthropy? Mm-hmm. So I think that is the first distinguishing factor we have to make. The second thing is I want to pick up where Tade had ended and where Kole had started to go. We're talking about the next frontiers, but whose next frontiers, right? Is it the next frontier for philanthropy? Is it the next frontier for where the world is going? Or is it the next frontier for what a just society demands? And where is our role in that? How are we enabling a more just society? How are we as philanthropy responding to a context that's changing in ways that support African agency, that support justice, and that support liberation? I think we have to keep coming back. There's a loop there that we're kind of missing. And for me, this means that while the world is changing in fundamental ways and the demands that are coming from our constituencies are changing radically, we have only been changing incrementally. And there's a big question to ask of ourselves about what is the courage, Tade, you mentioned courage, what is the courage to reimagine and to take bold action so that we are actually centering the constituencies who face the brunt of injustice?
So I'm going to push you a little bit because I think that's a beautiful answer, especially as you highlight the change that's happening radically coming from constituencies, but the change that's happening incrementally, potentially at organizational levels. And I think the follow-up question to you, Halima, is what are we going to have to leave behind as philanthropists in Africa, or organizations practicing philanthropy in Africa, if we are going to embrace a next frontier that centers, in your words, the constituents? What are we going to have to leave behind in how we do things going forward?
Can I tweak your question slightly? I'd like to focus on what we need to center rather than what we need to leave behind. I think our positionality in the space is important. I think who we center in terms of our priorities and how we do the work is important. I think the next frontier is asking the why we're doing this work, right? And we talk about agency, justice, liberation. It's asking the how. The how is really important. It's not about whether it is, and all of these are important, the IT evolutions, the fintech, all of the issue-based things are important. But the how we do the work in responding to the changes that require of us is important. And the who is important. Who is being centered when we are determining what is our work going to focus on? And so we have to center that. And once you center that, it becomes obvious what you leave behind.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Halima. I think that's absolutely fantastic. I see Dierdre nodding, so I'm hoping we'll double-click on that with her. But let me come to Professor Ali first. Professor, fortunately, I had line of sight of you as you were sitting listening to Dr. Tade, and I noticed that you were taking furious notes while you were speaking. So I want to know what you've written as a first step to the question. But I'd love to hear your comments as well. As Halima says to us, confront the why, confront the who, confront the how, and if we do those things, we are going to be able to get clarity about what that next frontier needs to look like. How do you react to that? How does that land for you? So, a few minutes for you, Professor Ali.
A nice try. We're going to still be friends after this. with that. But let me tell you my impression.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you, spontaneous giving,
Yeah.
which might be driven by all sort of values, it's palliative at its best. Palliative meaning that I'm going to feed someone, but I'm not going to prevent him from getting hungry tomorrow.
Yeah.
It will take systems. With this, you keep saying systemic. Systems mean systems. And a system, the first thing that's going to hit you with systems is governance. Governance is a big issue. And if you have any doubts, look at the American presidential elections or look in Europe. Look at the kind of clowns we're getting. It's because of bad governance. It's very hard to get governance. And part of it is because the system is very dynamic because of what Teddy was talking about.
Yeah.
That you cannot just sort of assume that I have it and the system is fine. It has to be very changed quite often. Now, there is a question I want you to ask, which is, have we delivered? My answer is a big no. Is a big no. And there are structural issues that prevents that. And as long as we're not talking about those structural issues and how to solve them, then we're just going to be going in the same loop again. I mean, 2 years down the road, 10 years down the road, we're going to be talking about the same things. The problem with systemic change is not a project that XYZ Foundation is going to sponsor for 4 or 5 years, and that's going to change the world. It requires, first, that it has to be indigenous. It has to be from, nobody's going to change you. You'll have to change from yourself. You'll have to have your own agenda. You'll have to decide. And then you check resources. Wherever you're going to get resources, if it helps you get the end that you want, then you take it. Otherwise, thank you. But this is the first question. This is the first thing. Systemic change is very hard. It takes 20, 30 years. It requires tremendous amount of discipline. It requires big bets. It requires a proper balance between top-bottom and bottom-up, which is often missing. So I mean, currently, we're not there. Did I say enough?
Sure. I think you said so much. I see so many heads nodding as you're speaking. Systemic change needs systems. I think that's such a powerful line. Governance, a mindset that takes us beyond projects, indigenous ownership, big bets that take time, 20 or 30 years. Let me follow up, Professor Ali. Are you confident that we have the know-how, the mindset, the drive to move towards the next frontier? So to do the work of building systems, to do the work of strengthening governance, as you're saying, to do the work to look beyond projects, to do the work of taking big bets when they matter most. And if not, what do we need to do?
I mean, there are many things you can start with as quick, a little bit quick. One of them is creating a true social change agents. People talking about change, this disruptive change, interestingly enough, it's very hard to spot because it always starts from the outliers. If you ask Bill Gates 40 years ago, what is the future of the internet, he's going to tell you, no, it's a desktop. And this is how he behaved. And then all of a sudden, it moves very quickly from fringes to mainstream.
Yeah.
And this is when you can spot it. I think the best way to create it is to actually be part of it. You do it. And if you're going to look at examples, good examples of good governance or good systems or good whatever, I don't think you're going to find it. You're going to find bits and pieces of it. And I would look in countries like India, like China. But India in specific, yes, they have lots of problems, but they're on the right track. I know it's not appealing. We tend to sort of think of the North, the
Yes.
US, the Europe for inspirations. And I think no, I think inspirations could get from countries like India. When you talk about healthcare, for example, believe it or not, a country like Cuba, they spend 1/10 of the US, And they have more or less, when you look at the KPIs, they are the same. So why in hell should I copy the American model if it's expensive and not delivering? But of course, the Americans, I mean, the teachers there, the professors, the whole apparatus do not want you to look at Cuba as a source of inspiration. And the way they do it, by the way, they're not focused on tertiary. They don't wait until somebody gets diabetes or blood pressure.
Yeah.
They put all their effort on preventive, and it's very community-driven. There are healthcare professionals who actually go to the community and work with the community. This is more effective. You don't build big hospitals for that. So anyway, so the first one, I mean, the hard problem is changing the mindset.
Yeah.
But I think you'd have to find a solution from within. And that's a big part of philanthropy. Now, don't expect an international foundation to come and tell you, take this money, and it's not going to happen. It has to be indigenous. It has to be from within. And you have to understand also that it's not philanthropy. Philanthropy is part of the game. It's a collaboration of many pieces that has to come together. Part of it is government. And unfortunately, you know governments in general, but government is a major important part. Civil society is important, and then private sector also. But that's why you'll have to be in a good governed setting. Otherwise, it's chaotic.
Professor Ali, thank you very much. Where we draw inspiration cements the power relations about what we think is best practice and how we emulate that. And I think it's a great challenge that you've put on the table for us as well, but also raising the significance of the ecosystem and the different players that need to be a part of that ecosystem. Dierdre, when you consider the phraseology of the next frontier, from your perspective, where you sit in the global north, what is unique about this opportunity, this moment in time, in its ability to reconfigure and reset philanthropy as we know it?
Thanks for the question, Nozi. Good morning, everyone. A few things come up for me as you raise that question, as I sit in my global South body as a queer Afro-Caribbean woman working in the global North. I think about some of the changes that are happening in the philanthropic space when we think about things like continued closing civic space. I think that's an important thing for us to think about. Many new foreign agent laws that are making it more and more difficult for us to do the work that we need to do in the places that we need to work. There's also the question of changes in leadership of many global North philanthropies, right? My own organization, Open Society Foundations, now has a new president. Ford Foundation mentioned that next year Darren Walker will be leaving. Hewlett just announced a new president coming in. And I think part of what these changes suggest are possible is that this is a new moment for us to be thinking in different and more innovative ways about how we do the work on the ground that we need to do. How do we leverage the moment of the new leaders who are coming in? How do we look at the moment of many global North organizations placing at their leadership, at their helm, global South leaders? And think about the ways in which those things provide opportunities for change, even if they're done in tokenistic ways. What are the openings that those things present for new frontiers to emerge and new ways of thinking? I think part of what we have to be thinking about as well is that there's a new wave, and it was mentioned a few times this morning already, of individual large donors in the philanthropic space who do not want to be encumbered by the bureaucracy of a foundation. And so they want to give larger amounts that often don't reach to the places that need it most. And so what is our role, my role, the role of people like me, to be able to say, giving on the ground is absolutely essential, so how do we continue to make that happen? So how do we work with organizations that are interested in things like accompaniment and thinking about how we grow the capacities of those organizations close to the ground, to think about what it means to not just be a pass-through for money, but to really, really care about the things that we've talked about this morning, right? To bring back that spirit of why are we doing this work and how do we see the people for whom the benefit of this work must ultimately redound. And I think one more thing that's important to name, as you talk about ecosystems, I think it's important for us as funders from the global north to think about the ecosystems that we enter. We can no longer afford to step into spaces and support the winners or just go all the way to the marginalized. We have to think about the way in which we are implicated in the spaces that we enter, that there is a responsibility we have for the way we enter and the dynamics of the space that we upset or honor. And how do we see ourselves as implicated in the project of working with ecosystems to strengthen them, bringing in the actors who have been historically marginalized, diversifying the voices that are here, and in some ways changing the table so that we could actually have the conversations that take us to the places that matter on the next frontier. One last point I want to make. I think when we talk about the next frontier, there's a lot of work in the space of global north philanthropy that is about firefighting in the present. Holding the gains that we have made is absolutely essential. But I think we cannot miss the opportunity to create the world that is trying to emerge, the world that all our hearts know is possible. And part of what that means is that while some of us fight on the front lines, some of us have to be creating and innovating and building that thing that all of us come to in the future, but doing it in a way that is joined up and connected. I think those are some of the reflections that come up for me in response to the question.
Dierdre, I think that's excellent. Thank you very much. And of course, I'm hearing a round of applause. Applause is welcome. We love applause at all times. And especially for challenging us about having to be here and there at the same time. Here doing the work of the firefighting, but there doing the work of what's required of us in the future. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to flex my moderator superpowers, and what that means is that I'm going to invite two voices in the audience. I still have a set of questions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to integrate those two voices in the final round of questions, and then I'll end with Dr. Tade, who's been sitting with such a great listening posture throughout this entire time, and that's where we're going to end. So do I have two people? Yes, madam, I see your hand. So, and I see your hand, madam. Fantastic. Can we get a roving mic? I can take this one. Thank you, sir. As you pose your question, please just very briefly tell us who you are, pose your question, short, sharp, and concise, and then we'll go to Madame on that side, and then we'll do it as a final round of questions together. Go ahead.
I'm Mero Biero. I work with the Church World Service based in Nairobi. Church World Service is faith-based, non-profit. Mine are two concerns. As we look into the next frontier, I'm a bit surprised that we don't have faith voice in this space. And faith is huge in giving for good. I'm talking about the church, I'm talking about any faith. I have not heard that since Monday. Secondly, as we move to the next frontier, and as African continent, we must pay attention to the young people. By 2030, 40% of the world population of the young people will be coming from Africa. And if we don't induct them into this process, then we are going to have it very difficult.
Thank you very much, madam. So the question on faith actors in the ecosystem, where are they? And the question of young people. So I will weave them in. So let's keep going. And then let's get the second question. Madam, please go for it.
Hi.
Let's try that again. I think that microphone's not on.
Hi everyone, my name is Karen Pillay. I'm from the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, located in South Africa, but we work on 23 countries on the African continent. So my question is to Dierdre, and well said. My question is that looking at the fact that global South leaders are being placed in positions of power in global North organizations, does this not place global South leaders in a really, really powerful position to actually influence the agenda of the next frontier for the African continent? The other thing is, it also brings to mind that they have to respect, acknowledge, and acknowledge the power of African philanthropy. So how do we, as Africans from the continent, leverage that from our leaders being there in the global to say, prioritize our continent, prioritize the agenda of our continent? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. So, how do we ensure that leaders from the global south who are in positions of power in the north are able to put Africa on the agenda? And how do we leverage their presence for the benefit of Africa? So let me then work us through our final round of questions, which will be shorter and sharper and more concise. Dr. Kole, I want to come to you first. One of the threads that has been running in this conversation has been the emergence of new actors in philanthropy. I think Dr. Tade referred to them as mega donors. We've also are aware, of course, that there are the private sector is becoming an increasingly big player, sports personalities, the diaspora, and so much more. How do we ensure that the expansion of the arena with more players in the arena translates positively for the future of African philanthropy? How do we make sure that it's not just a case of more, but it's a case of more that translates into meaningful?
Thank you very much. And I think that, yes, there are a number of new players that are in the field now. I will just take, for example, remittances, which have been mentioned by a number of our friends here. And we know that remittances, about 95 billion in the continent, is a huge amount of money by the 2022 inflow. And we know that most of the remittances are going into really respond to immediate needs of our people, whether in terms of, water, healthcare, and all kinds of problems that our people face and our things. And probably there are very little of that really going into the big ideas that probably are also critical and very important into our society and our things. So, how do we tap into these remittances that are coming so that they can also play a big role in some of the big issues that are also happening in our place and our things? So we need to think of how do we organize those remittances so that they become more contributory towards social transformation. I'm not in any way minimizing the daily needs and the daily realities of our people, but I think that there's a way in which we may be able to see how these resources can also be used towards transforming the continent as well. Thank you.
Dr. Kole, I think that's excellent because it also links to the point that Professor Ali had made earlier. As you talk about organization and organizing ourselves, there must be systems to do that because that organization doesn't happen in a vacuum. Dr. Dulani, let me come to you with the question of partnerships. As we journey towards a new frontier, one would imagine that there are new configurations of partnerships that have the promise of sustainability, of scale, of impact. What are you seeing as some of the more exciting aspects of our partnership that we need to be paying attention to in order to really move towards the future of philanthropy on the continent?
Thank you. And actually, that, if I may also just address that with a question on where are the faith, faith voices, I think, in this discussion. I do come from Malawi, and we have a local saying that says, I'll just translate it into English, but that one head cannot, just one single head, you cannot really lift an entire roof of a house on your head. And that just really speaks to the need to collaborate with different stakeholders.
Yeah.
I think today's challenges call for multiple solutions, multiple actors, multiple strategies, and I think this just underscores the importance of collaboration. Philanthropists, governments, working with the faith-based, faith groups, working with the private sector, which we have not even talked about, academia as well, as among many actors out there. Because working together, there is, I think, a possibility of achieving more. And we've seen this during COVID. The Sustainable Development Goals, among many topics that require multiple action, multiple strategies, and the increased collaboration to leverage, I think, the diversity as well as the resources to address these very complex global challenges and more effectively if we have to be effective.
Professor Boniface, of course, as we talk about new models, we also need to talk about new partnerships. It means new models. And so, Professor Ali, I want to come to you with the question around new models of giving. We're increasingly hearing the shift, or seeing the shift from giving to impact investing, and others would even say we're seeing a move of philanthropy increasingly playing the role of de-risking social investments. What do you make of that? And more importantly, what models are promising as we see this trend on the horizon as well that you think that we should be looking into? Yes.
Okay. I just want to tell you one thing. The term impact investment was actually coined by the Rockefeller Foundation.
Yeah.
So, and when you look at some of the people doing a fantastic impact investment, Ford Foundation jumps into the front. So now, my view, in people in innovation, they have something called the pioneer's gap. When you have a new idea, and to get it into, and it's actually proven that it works. You proved it in the lab, you proved it in a small scale. To get it into mainstream, there is a huge gap. And the reason you have this gap is because of a lack of funding, because an investor, a typical investor, impact banker, whatever you call, is not going to put the money because there is a very high risk. So who's going to do this kind of a risk? A potential candidate or philanthropy.
Yeah.
Now, this applies everywhere, even commercial, even in social. In social, it's even more, because as we've talked, you'll have to come up with innovative solutions to how do I get healthcare to the poor? How do I get housing, cheap housing to everybody? How do I provide education, quality education to everyone? So you need to experiment, you need to, and there are lots of risks. So anyway, I hope what I'm trying to tell you is that I don't see a difference between both. If you have a good plan, if you see the whole cycle, and you can understand that I need to put some money here so I can get it later on.
Yeah.
When you do system change, one of the things that's going to hit you right away is that there is a fixed charge to change. You need to develop industry in Zimbabwe. The first thing you need to do is build roads. What is the return on investment on building roads? It's huge, but it's not direct. It enables people to come and move and do things. This is sometimes they call it building an ecosystem, building a marketplace. There is a fixed charge.
Yeah.
And that's an ideal place where you put either government money, and if the government is not capable, then philanthropy. This is where you should put your money. Now, granted also, philanthropy could work as a catalyst. Catalyst is some sort of a de-risking.
Yeah.
You show people that this is interesting because Foundation XYZ is putting enough money there. Even they might put 1% of the total pie, but they encourage people to come. So, I mean, those kind of things where you, again, it's all around the same concept of de-risking. But I would not think of them as this or that.
Yeah, they should be complementary from what I'm hearing.
Yes, where they have to understand the life cycle and where to use what.
So very quick follow-up. Professor Radebe said to us, we must also think about social entrepreneurship in the context of this conversation, and that feels like a good place to come back to that and to bring in the question of where the young people are. Is that a pathway social entrepreneurship, of getting young people in, excited about the conversation of building communities, giving back to people, doing good, even if it's through social entrepreneurship and potentially impact investing? Yes.
I think personally, I mean, when you think of entrepreneurship at large, there is a probability at least of less than 20% of success. This is very risky. If I were to invest, I would invest in teaching youth life skills, self-sustenance, how do they find jobs, how do they work, freelancing, things that helps them do it by themselves first. Now, if they pass this, then I'll select the best of them, because not everybody's going to be an entrepreneur, even social entrepreneurs. It's the same thing, more or less.
More or less.
I will teach them social engagement, and they could do it in different forms. It doesn't have to be financial. They volunteer.
Thank you very much, Prof. Ali. Halima, I think it would be amiss to let you go off stage without hearing your voice on the role of philanthropy and reparations, and where does that sit in the future of philanthropy as you consider the next frontiers? Is this a conversation that is gaining prominence? Is it weakening? And how do we make sure that it has its rightful place as we consider what philanthropy needs to look like?
Thanks. Can I just also quickly respond to the faith-based?
Yes, please go ahead.
You asked earlier, what are we leaving behind?
Yes.
We need to leave many things behind. But one of them is this notion that we need to leave many things behind. One of them is this notion that we can separate faith from our individual giving behaviors, from our identity, and from what roots our motivations of giving on this continent. It cannot. There are many studies being done on faith and philanthropy. They're just not being talked about in this space. And so we have to ask ourselves, why is it that we aren't seeing faith-based organizations here? Why aren't we seeing faith-motivated development organizations, which are huge on this continent, within this space? There's a gap that we have to answer for, and I think we have to take responsibility when we say the philanthropy sector. How do we expand what we mean by the philanthropy sector? The other thing we have to leave behind is this notion of that volunteerism and civic activism is not in philanthropy, and that doesn't lead to systemic change. Let's look at Kenya right now. Let's look at the thousands of people that put their bodies on the line, and what's the systemic change that has led to. It's not either or. It's not that the everyday bad charitable giving just does this, and the big social justice giving does that. I think we have to rethink and challenge ourselves on these important notions of what we value and what value add comes from those. I want to talk about reparations. Thank you for raising that. And I think we can't talk about reparations without talking about agency, right? So we are saying here that we are all about African agency. So I want to ask, where's the agency of our African philanthropic institutions? How much independence do we have in a context where many of us in this room are reliant on resources that come from the global north, resources that come with global strings? The fact that there is silence about an ongoing genocide in Palestine right now, the fact that there is silencing, and the fact that we can't talk about it in the space means that we don't have agency. And let's be honest about that. Why is this a hidden conversation? Why are we having it in small areas in the room? So we link agency to our own resources, and we're having a lot of conversations around decolonization. You can't have a conversation on decolonization without thinking about where are the independent resources for your own agency. Yeah. And that just comes from two places. One, we need to think about the resourcing on this continent. We talked about everyday giving here, we talked about high net worth giving there, but there's a vast range of givers in between. There are small business givers, there are professional givers, there are diaspora givers, there are people in this room who are all giving. There are so many different types of givers that never get counted, and the resources are flowing, and they are flowing through institutions. We saw in a session yesterday that more than 63% of organizations rated individual giving on the African continent among their top 3 or top 4 sources of giving. What does that mean for African agency? What does that value bring to us? The second thing is to talk about how can we talk about decolonization without talking about reparations? We are supporting all of these conversations out there that talk about decolonization in all of the other spaces, and we're talking about reparations for slavery, we're talking about reparations for colonialism. Let's talk about international philanthropic reparations. What does it mean to really shift privilege, not just power? What does it mean to shift privilege, shift your resources so that resources sit in the hands of African organizations who have their own agency?
Thank you very much, Halima. And just to highlight, yes, round of applause, we have a massive conversation on global governance led by Naila Faruqi, which I think is taking place at 2:30. And of course, we haven't delved into the climate change conversation because we have a big climate change conversation, which is also taking place tomorrow. Dierdre, final question. I want to bring the question from Karen, which is to say, are we doing enough to leverage the presence of Global South leaders in northern structures? And how can we do a better job of that?
It's a lonely place to be a leader from the Global South heading a Global North organization, because there is an assumption that you bring the ability to make change when you are potentially encumbered by structures that prevent you from making the kind of radical and transformative change that is necessary. We had a conversation about this over dinner the other night. So I think I want to start there by acknowledging that it is a tall ask to have one single person make that change, that we need allies, we need foot soldiers, we need reinforcements at our back, and we need people who understand the struggle of what it means to be in a context where you are doubted and your ability to actually make change can sometimes be constrained and limited. So I want to start with that as the baseline. But I also want to say that people from the Global South heading Global North organizations are uniquely positioned because we have experienced what it means to be marginalized. We know what it means to want change and to see a repeat of patterns, decades-long patterns, that do not break the cycles of the things that need to be broken. And so part of what I feel a deep sense of commitment to is what are the kinds of ways in which through my work I can facilitate those leaders finding spaces where they can have a safe port, a safe place to think together, a safe place to find allyship with others like them, but also others who understand the struggle that they're in. And what might that mean for our work in general? I think there's one more thing I want to mention. It's about giving ourselves the time to allow the change that needs to happen. Part of the reason we haven't had change for the decades that we've had in the past, and I'm thinking specifically here with my old education hat on, 40 years, 50 years, no change in any significant or meaningful way. It is because our appetite for risk and innovation is limited, and our ability, sometimes when we step into these spaces, part of what we have to have is the courage to say, I might only get this one shot. So what do I do with it to make it count? And how do I take the moment to use the resources that have been given to me to leverage the kind of change that's needed? At the same time, I think there's a part of philanthropy that needs to recognize the ways in which we have to see our responsibility in the spaces that we step into to honor agency, see the ways in which there is a limit. What are our limits? But also, how do we avoid claiming the kinds of victories that are not ours, but that are those of people in the field? I think those are important concepts that I want to be able to put into the space for us to name, that are important tensions that we ride in organizations like mine.
Thank you so much, Dierdre. Thank you so much. I think that definitely deserves a round of applause. Thank you so very much. So, Dr. Tade, Dr. Kole, thank you for playing musical chairs. I do appreciate it. And so, an opportunity for you, Dr. Tade, as we close, just in 2 minutes, having listened to this conversation, having started and activated the conversation, the benefit of having listened to all our experts on the panel, what do you walk away with? Just the middle button. Yeah.
Yes, I think lots of things have come up in the conversations. And the first thing is that philanthropy cannot do it alone. The issue of systemic transformation requires building coalitions, building constituencies, and bringing various groups together to do that. And it's not just going to be philanthropy. The second one is, where is African money for African transformation? And it's very interesting because there's a lot of African money going to African helping, giving to help and helping to give, in that sense. There's a lot of African money at that level. It's the big social justice, big social change impulse that we are not able to harvest African resources. And Mama Grasa Michelle, I think you are a master at doing that. I remember some of the conversations that I had that you have had with high net worth individuals in Africa to bring money to the table for some causes that you were part of. But we need more of that. When I started as a very young activist, it was easier for me to go to the Ford Foundation and get money to support me, to do something that's important in terms of changing things where I was, than to go to an African philanthropist at that time, or philanthropist, to say, we're having problems. We're in a students' movement. We have all these problems. Can you give us some resources to do something? So that has to change. We must be able to have conversations, real serious conversations. We, the high net worth individuals on the continent, with those who have resources, and then maybe the other way we've not been looking at it when we talk about shifting the power. Halima, good to see you again. Shifting the power and shifting the privilege is that if we cannot access significant individual sources of wealth, why don't we begin to work on pooling the wealth? New kinds of, and you talk about collaborations and collaboratives, but whenever we talk about collaboratives, we talk about the big philanthropies and foundations, institutionalized philanthropy. There's a lot. If you look at the logic behind insurance, you look at the logic behind tontines, you look at the merry-go-rounds, we have not actually developed, and that's where Professor Ali, you're right, we have not developed the infrastructure and the systems for tapping philanthropic assets on the continent that come from the bottom up. Where the conversations we will have is that it's a collective problem. Gender-based violence, wars, attack on our communities, climate change, erosion, and all of that. And that has been tried before. I remember the founder of KCDF in those days, $1 per day, in Kenya in those days. It's been tried at really micro levels. We need to begin to think of much more, mega, macro pooling of the collective resources from the bottom up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tade. Ladies and gentlemen, can I ask of you to please give my panelists a massive, massive round of applause. Thank you very much. Our opening plenary that has set the tone and set the scene for many of the conversations to come, and many of the issues that we weren't able to get to but will be drilled down in the next plenaries as well as the parallel sessions.